shouldn't take too long. It's just on substrates. And then next week we're going to get into rounds that are going to go on top of substrates. And then the week after that we're going to get into priming, sizing and priming. So we're going to kind of break up this whole idea of our rounds to encompass 3 weeks. By the end of this course, one of the requirements is that you bring in either a stretched or a mounted canvas that you've prepared to paint on to prove that you know how to do it. So that's kind of what we're going to look at for the next few weeks. So make sure you ask whatever questions you need to ask. You won't be taken seriously as an artist if you don't know how to at least stretch your own canvas or create one. So you're going to need to know how to do that, because there's also some stability issues with the canvas you guys are using in class. These cheap linen panels, they're not intended to last forever. They're more like your practice, student grade stuff. So you wouldn't want to do any permanent work on them. But we'll show you how to make some more permanent supports. And that's what we're going to look at this week and the next couple of weeks too. So we're looking at the most common substrates used in painting. Not too much at some of the historical stuff, because we're living now in a realm or a day and age when we have access to higher quality materials that are going to last us a little longer. So we don't need to focus too much on some of the stuff that they painted on in the past. But we'll start there. So hardwood is the, or hardwood, I'm sorry, is the traditional panel that paintings were done on. And hardwood is just a big, nice, thick slab of wood. It would need to be at least an inch thick if you're intending to paint on it. They're going to be rather expensive, actually, because hardwood is not as common now as it was when people were painting hundreds of years ago, because we've chopped down all of our big trees. So it's going to be harder for you to find a large piece of pure hardwood that's not plied. So hardwood, we're talking about just a solid chunk of wood. It's a decent painting support, but one of the worst you could have for wood. There's a lot better choices we can make than traditional hardwood board. Wood is, by its very nature, cellular, and those cells, if not properly seasoned, can take on moisture and expand and contract. So hardboard has some serious structural issues in the long run. So you just have to be aware of that. It needs to be a properly seasoned board, meaning a few years given for it to dry thoroughly before it can be used as an artist's round. So keep that in mind if you have any wood lying around. You need to make sure that it's a proper support to paint on. The other thing you'll notice about hardwood is that it's very, very heavy. So hauling it around ends up not being as practical. It's fairly durable if you drop it, though, so that's one of the good things. If you're clumsy, it may be a better choice for you. But there will be some serious warping issues. You can overcome some of the warping issues by doing something called cradling, which we'll look at later on. But cradling is applying a series of strips to the back of the wood to prevent it from warping too much. The problem, though, is that because hardwood is just one solid slab of wood, with grains going in a particular direction, they will oppose to some degree the grains of the cradle, and it can cause the board actually to do some cracking, because they won't flex with the same degree that we would have with another wood. So there can also be some serious issues with that. So when you're looking for a substrate to paint on or to mount some linen onto, you would want to use hardwood as sort of your last resort in this day and age. A more common wood that we're going to see, and we're going to see it everywhere, is plywood or plywood. So this can be some softer woods too. It doesn't even have to be a hardwood. It can be something like pine or some other cheap, inexpensive wood. But the way that they've extracted, they basically shaved the wood to a very thin layer, and then they've glued several layers together, but they glue them with opposing grains, so at 90-degree angles. So the first sheet will have a grain running this way, the next sheet will have a grain running this way, the next sheet will have a grain running this way. So those opposing grains act to balance each other out and tug against each other as they expand and contract, and create a bit more stable of support than a hardwood can offer. They come in a variety of numbers of plies, and you might imagine the more ply you get, the more structurally sound the wood is going to be. So we're going to see something like 3 ply as the minimum number, and that's going to be like 1/8 of an inch or so. That's acceptable to use for paintings that are small in nature, so maybe 11 by 14 or under. If you're going to use a 3 ply wood, larger than 11 by 14, you're going to need to start cradling, bump it up to like 1/4 inch. And then if you end up going larger than an 18 by 24, you're going to have to do thicker than 1/4 inch for the plywood, or you'll have to cradle.
What size do you think we need for that? Like, how many plies?
Probably more than 5. It would just depend on how thin the plies are. You'll notice that the wood will vary. So the Göttingen book has good recommendation. I'm gonna pull that out here. You know, this is a contemporary book, so it is a little bit more relevant to the materials you're going to find at, say, a lumber yard. But he talks in here about the specifications for, you know, if you're going to go larger than this size with this wood, you need to make sure you cradle it or get more ply. All this section he has on all the supports that we're looking at today. And then there's even he does this really great thing. He throws all these charts in here in the back that says, you know, it's good for this size, you can accept this ground, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really good, again, a really good reference source.
What page is that?
Well, for this edition, what do you ask, which, the charts?
That, what you're looking at now.
For the chart where he's talking about wood on this edition, which is the, the 3rd or 5th, I can't remember which, is 68 to 72.
Okay.
And again, if it's a different edition, it'll be a different page.
But it'll be in the area.
Yeah, you can always just look in the index or the table of contents for it as well. That's probably a smarter thing to do. So a lot of information on the substrates there. Guidelines for when you should start cradling. But it'll actually be somewhat obvious because, and this also depends to a degree on the quality of the wood that you get from the store. You'll notice that if you get a larger sheet of it, it'll tend to be more warped. But as you cut it down, the warping is less prominent. And then you get into something like 8 by 10s and 9 by 12s, and there's little, if any, warp at all, even on the smaller plies. It's just when you start to get into some of that bigger sheets that you're going to notice that warp. And that's when we're going to want to start cradling. So the 3 ply will be sufficient for smaller works, most of the stuff that we do in class here. If you're going to do larger works, something like the size of this, you're going to bump it up to a 5 ply. And then beyond that, either a thicker ply or a larger number of sheets in the ply or cradle. So the thing to remember about plywood is that it's got a really nice amount of glue in there to really hold those plies together. However, they are susceptible to lots of atmosphere or weather attacks, you might say. So you must make sure you properly sand and seal the sides and the back of the plywood. Because if you're using raw wood and say it gets wet and moisture seeps into the ply, it'll spread them apart and you'll get warping and then your painting can fall apart. So make sure you do seal the sides of that. Göttingen recommends using just a regular old size and gesso that we'll talk about next week. There's other more industrial sealants that we could use, like polyurethane or spar polyurethane, which is meant for boats, you know, to keep out weather. But you have to keep in mind that those are not intended for 100-year foresight. They're intended usually for a decade or a few decades, so you may run into some issues with brittling or flaking off later in the time. So you have to keep that in mind. But gessos are intended to last for a bit longer, so that's the traditional choice. If you are not able to cradle a board for whatever reason, so let's say, for example, you need to get some like 16 by 20 panels and you don't think you're going to be able to cradle it, and you get them all cut at Home Depot or Lowe's, you know, you go there and you buy your big sheet and tell them, I want 16 by 20 panels. They'll throw it on the chopper and chop it all up for you. If you're not able to cradle it, what you can do is paint gesso on the back in an X. So painting it in an X, layer of gesso, will tighten and expand at the same time as the front side tightens and expands on the painting. So a big gessoed X on the back of your panel will actually counterbalance some of the warping that can occur on the facing. So that's your cheapest, most quick, cost-effective way to handle bracing of the panel at slightly larger sizes.
When something's framed, does that also provide the support for it?
For the edges, but not for the middle. The middle can
Okay.
buckle and expand. So yeah, framed painting after a number of years can be warped on the inside. So that X will help to prevent
On
that.
the back and front side?
Well, the front side you're going to apply gesso or the canvas, so it would just be the back. So each layer of gesso that you add to a board, if you're going to be, for example, priming the board directly, each layer of gesso you add to the front side, you would add a layer of the X on the back.
Now,
Why would you gesso the whole thing?
yeah, that was my question.
You can gesso the whole back.
It's
Yes.
faster and less gesso to do the X.
Right. Yeah. And especially if it's a large panel. Yeah.
Are the glues non-acidic, and if they aren't, can they seep through the wood, and will the gesso prevent that from coming up?
Of plywood.
Yes.
Yeah, that's always the risk with some plywood. If you don't know the company that's producing it, they could be using some cheap glues or some glues with formaldehyde, et cetera, et cetera. The gesso sometimes acts as a decent barrier. Gotzingen recommends using an acrylic dispersion medium over the face of it to prevent any migration of materials from the board up to the layers. So we'll talk about that next week. There is an alternative to plywood that actually can be fairly useful, at least for our purposes here, and that's called hardboard, or MDF board. So this is Masonite is a brand name of a hardboard that is a micro.
But MDF is different.
Yeah, those two seem like they're different. Are they basically the same from your viewpoint? Masonite's a brown and it has kind of a rough side on that. Whereas the MDF is,
It's like Hardwood board almost.
it's just a big uniform piece of.
Masonite is made of layers of paper that are bonded together, whereas
Incorrect.
Oh,
Yeah. And where's MDF go on?
MDF is like powdered wood.
Yes,
Sorry.
powdered wood. That's what Masonite is. So they've steamed it under pressure to burst all the fibers. So it's not layered. Masonite's not layered. And then when it's in water, they submerge it and mash it all into a sheet. And then the natural lignin in the glue, which holds the glue cells together, that's what's holding the MDF board together. It can be tempered or untempered, so the surface can be slick and hard, or it can be soft and porous. It can have a texture, or it can be completely smooth. A lot of variety to it. But you're using the natural glue that's found in wood, and it's not layered, it's very dense.
So you're saying the natural glue found in wood. So you're saying during that process, this glue comes out of the wood, or?
Yes.
Okay, so they're not adding extra glue to it?
Correct.
Okay.
And this is why it can be more advantageous than a plywood, right? Because a plywood, you're subject to whatever glue the company's using. An MDF or a Masonite type board, you're just using the natural glue of the wood. However, some companies, and if you get some stuff from China, they can add stuff like formaldehyde or other bad ingredients to the wood to help preserve it and stretch it out and make it last longer. So you have to be careful still sometimes and stuff like that. Mark Gotzingen recommends utilizing alcohol, wiping the whole board front and back with alcohol, tempered or untempered, it doesn't matter, to clean all the grease, all the bad additives off of it, and then you can use it to mount or prime. Now, if it's a super, you can get it in a super textured or super smooth. I painted on both. The super textured sometimes is nice because if you prime that, then it's like the weave of a canvas because they're just using a screen to print on the texture. So that can actually be a pleasant surface to paint on. But if you like a smooth surface, that's certainly achievable as well. What's not recommended, however, by Gotzingen is, which he used to recommend, but after speaking with some colleagues that changed it, is they used to say to sand it down a little bit. But you can end up bursting some, removing some of the lignin and bursting the cells open on the top, the pulp open, and then it can cause some damage. So don't sand it unless there is, you'll notice when you cut it sometimes, moisture or even an unsharp blade can cause some swelling in the cuts. So you can sand that down, but you have to immediately seal it to prevent anything from getting inside of it. Question, Kat?
Yeah, Masonite will have the brand will have like a smooth side.
Yep.
It's almost a
It's
glassy
the tempered,
finish.
yeah.
And then the other side is almost hairy, So if you want to use either side, would you gesso both of them first? Or either of them first, and how many layers?
Yes, in equal number, both.
So you'd have to do both sides.
Yeah, and that would be the same reason that we talked about with the X.
Yeah.
If you're gessoing just one side, then you have the risk of the gesso or the paint film contracting or expanding and causing warping. So you want an equal pressure on the backside to counteract that.
Okay, and you wouldn't sand the smooth side to give it a little tooth to grab onto that gesso?
No, wipe it with alcohol. That'll actually remove a lot of the smoothness. Yeah, it's
okay.
an oil that they impregnate into the surface to make it slicker. And so if you want to paint on that, that's fine. If you don't like the smoothness, flip it to the other side. But do wipe off with alcohol to remove the excess oil.
On this, would you also gesso the edges?
Yes, the edges too.
Okay.
Yeah. So just coat the whole bad boy in gesso. Yeah.
And what is the difference between tempered and non-tempered?
The tempered one is the one that's been impregnated with the oil. So that's going to be the shiny, slick, smooth, hard side.
That's the tempered?
Yeah, that's tempered. Untempered is just the raw particle or a raw MDF.
And how many layers of gesso did you say?
As many as you want,
Okay.
but equal amounts.
Take it on there.
So even though MDF and Masonite look very different, MDF is usually like almost a white or an off-white color when I buy it anyway.
Are you talking about MDF with a laminate on it?
No, I'm talking, it's off-white, kind of a tan color, but they're still made the same way and are basically the
Yeah, are you talking about like the creamish ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the
And
same. It's
MDF.
just different wood pulp
Okay.
they're using.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, because every once in a while the Lowe's and Home Depot like switch up their sources for MDF. So sometimes you go in there and it's a blonde like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Sometimes you go in there and it's a little darker or richer red like this. Sometimes you go in there and it's dark like this. So it doesn't really, it's all the same stuff. What you don't want is like a particle board where like there's big chunks of it. Now Gotzingen says that's actually structurally sound, but we don't know long-term ramifications of painting on it. So he says just be aware of it. And it's kind of difficult to get a clean surface on that.
I have a piece, but the back of it looks like it's swollen a little, so should I just discard it? I don't know if like moisture got into it
Yeah.
on the rough side, so
Uh-huh.
it doesn't appear like there was any on the front. Should I just discard it?
Yeah,
You
it would be,
never
yeah,
know.
you never know how far deep that goes.
Okay.
If you can, is this like a large sheet?
Mhm.
Well, if you can, you might be able to cut off that section of it and then seal the other section, and then you'll be okay.
Does Luan fall under hardwood or plywood?
Does
It's
what?
plywood, Luan, do you know what that
I
is?
don't know what that is.
Okay,
The
so
line
what-
is very thin.
It's very thin.
Pretty black.
yeah,
Okay,
So it's plywood.
so. it's
okay, it
plywood.
falls under there.
What's it called, lawn?
Luan, Luan. They use it for underlayments on floors when they're putting new floors in.
Yeah, that's certainly usable. Underlayment actually makes some nice panels sometimes. Yeah, and it's relatively inexpensive. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're getting a 3-ply sheet of this stuff, it can be $15 for 4 foot by 8 foot, and you can chop that up and make dozens and dozens of panels. You just have to make sure you seal it properly.
Again, the gesso or the polyurethane.
Yeah,
And
and
it's soaked in when I tried to gesso it.
yeah, some woods are a lot more
Yeah.
absorbent than other woods, so that's something to keep in mind. but that'll depend on the wood itself, yeah. So there's not a whole lot of requirements that you need to worry about when selecting a plywood, but you do need to make sure at least one surface is smooth enough and not irregular to be able to paint on. So I've actually even gotten some thicker panels before, and a lot of times to save money, they use lower quality ply on the inner side, and then on one side they'll put a nice sheet of ply, and that's actually acceptable to use for painting, as long as you have the one side to accept the linen or
Oh, you mean like
just
the birch face?
like what?
Like birch face?
Space.
ply?
Yeah. Then so that way you can save on cost a little bit. You flip it over and the backside is generally not very attractive because there's like knots in it or deep gouges of grain and things like that. But as long as the one side of it is smooth enough, then it can be used for painting.
Needs to be both sides again sealed. Okay.
Yes, yeah, same rules apply there. If you're going to get super large, this is when wood gets really heavy. So you have a couple of options. You can either cradle a thin ply of wood, or you can even get a cord wood. So something even like a door. Our conservators have actually said that some doors can make great painting surfaces because they're like a hardboard, and then they've got a honeycomb core on the inside to support a very large structure, and so you pick up a door and it's relatively light. So if you wanted to get, say, a large canvas, you could get a hall door that doesn't have the holes cut out in it, and you've got this nice big canvas, and then you can apply linen to it or gesso to it, and you pick it up and it's relatively lightweight. If you end up deciding to cut it down, you have to be savvy enough to be able to cut a strip of wood and seal it back up so that moisture doesn't get inside the core. But it can be modified to some degree.
I think if you cut it down, there's a piece of wood at the bottom, you just shove it up into the,
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true. Yeah.
we've done cut doors before, so.
There you go. So yeah, that is certainly a viable option for painting, and some artists do that. If you're another option, we get into our paper substrates, and so with paper, we've got the only paper substrate that you can safely use would be museum board, which is typically linen or cotton rag, not acidic like other mat boards generally, but flimsy. So they're really nice if you're going to, say, mount some linen on them for traveling. Say you want to bring a bunch of canvases somewhere, but you don't want it to take up much space and you want it to be super lightweight. You can mount some linen to these museum boards, and then they're rigid enough for you to put them on a canvas and paint on them. And then if one of them comes out nicely, you can either frame it as you would a drawing with a mat, or you can mount it to a panel and then hang it in a traditional frame. So I know a lot of artists I know who do a lot of traveling in plein air stuff where they're going to do small sketches everywhere. They'll do something like that.
So it's canvas, but mounted on
Museum board.
a museum board.
Some artists I know will even gesso the museum board. So that's considered acceptable, but most likely not as permanent as working directly on a wood panel. But you'll increase the longevity of it if you mount the painting with the sun. So if you prime it, gesso it, paint directly on the museum board, if you like it, adhere it to wood.
Is that a brand, museum board, or is it?
No,
There are 5 companies that make it. Museum board's made from second cut linters, and Strathmore and Rising make the 2, 4, and 8 ply museum board.
So it's flexible?
It's like a cardboard?
So it's not a big-
Yeah, it's like a mat board.
It's not a big
Okay.
board.
That's its purpose.
It's not a board board.
It's
Yeah.
for
Is that like-
conservation framing.
Like the mat that you made?
Yeah, that's
Museum
that's
board?
not museum board.
But it's like that.
Yeah, it's just, that's made out of wood pulp, whereas museum board's made out of second cut linters, which is a type of cotton.
Oh, so it's like a cardboard. Is it a cardboard?
Well, do you know what mat board is?
Yeah, just mat board.
Yeah, it's a high grade mat board.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
But it's
So
made
instead
in
of-
ply. It's made in ply.
Yeah, it's made in ply,
okay.
and it's usually made with cotton and linen fibers instead of paper pulp.
But when it says museum, it's not archival or anything.
It is archival,
Well, yeah,
that's
it
why
is.
they call it museum board.
Okay,
The idea is that, you know
It's
how
light.
mats will sometimes stain your artwork
Mhm.
after 20 years?
right,
Museum board won't because it's made of cotton.
okay.
So this is a dumb question, I'm sure, but
Neutral
why,
pH.
if you were traveling, wouldn't you just use your linen, tape it like we do to a board, and then when you get home, mount it?
Well, you still, because if you're traveling, the paintings are drying, you'll end up still with a lot of boards with the linen tapes too.
Okay, all right, okay, for that reason
Yeah.
only, okay.
And so these end up being a lot more, and less likely to damage them than a loose sheet of linen thrown into your luggage. Yeah, I did that for France, especially I bought a painting kit that, I think it was from M. Graham. And so it came with all the little paint tube holders and some brushes and a palette knife and some medium, and then 5 museum boards that were like 5 inches by 12 inches. And so I just mounted some linen to them, and I had a whole painting kit right there, and it was like this big. And so I did a lot of sketches in France with that. And then when they turned out well, I just mounted them to some wood when I got home. Saves a lot of space and time and money and a lot of
So are you mounting?
How do you transport those?
Well, I had a All Prima Pochade box, which has
Okay.
handle holders in it. So those were dry enough by then that they didn't need to go in the slot, so I could just drop them in there amongst the paintings, and then they just rested in there. Because it's rigid enough to be fairly durable, the museum board, especially if you get the heavier ply stuff.
So excuse me, so when you're mounting your linen to your museum board, are you mounting it, like wrapping it and stapling it, or are you actually applying it with some kind of adhesive?
Not stapling it, but yeah, an adhesive.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you recommend for the adhesive?
We'll talk about that when we
Okay.
talk about mounting. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Well, yeah, we'll spend a whole day on that sort of stuff. But
Do you,
yeah.
excuse me, do you find, because I took 8 by 10 on Gator board
Mhm.
to France, and that was fine, they're light, but,
Yeah.
they're still, it's still the size when you get.
When you stack a whole bunch of
Right,
them up, yeah.
Right, but I mean, it's very lightweight, but,
Yes.
I had a few left that I just passed to people because I didn't make them. But a lot of the women there were using the linen sheets that they would just tape to a board,
Uh-huh.
and then they used like liquid type, so that they were pretty well dry by the
Yeah.
end of the thing, end of the
Mhm.
session.
And they rolled them up or what?
No, by then they're dry enough so you can stack them.
Okay.
But if you have something mounted too, you can take like push pins and put them in the corners.
Yeah.
And then put them face to face,
Mhm.
and just be careful you're not crushing them, but that'll keep them separate enough so that.
Yep. Yeah, there's lots of ways to transport the stuff that we get into. Myself and other artists I know have had some issues with loose sheets getting like folded on inadvertently and stuff like that. So most of the folks I know will actually at least just make a whole stack of museum board sketches. Even Sue Line, when she just came in town, she had a bunch of her demos that were all on museum board laid out. And that's kind of nice because, yeah, you can just mount a huge sheet of it and cut it down any size you want and good to go.
And when you remove the linen from it, is it?
You don't need to
reusable?
remove the linen from it.
Oh, okay.
You just mount the museum board directly to,
Oh,
and
so
you
much
substrate, yeah.
Okay.
yeah. So it's, it just sort of avoids the whole having to tack it up and work on a larger board. So the last thing we're going to talk about are our fabric substrates. Mostly we're just dealing with canvas and linen here. Those are our historical fabrics that pop up in the time of the Renaissance. They are good painting substrates, but according to Mark Otzingen, one of the worst you can use. They're not ideally suited for oil paint because they're so flexible. And oil paint film dries to be typically much more rigid than a canvas will. Canvas will get brittle over time and is subject to a lot of atmospheric changes. So the conservators always say, if you really want your stuff to last, you should actually be mounting your canvas onto a panel. But out of convenience and habit, we stretch, and stretching is convenient because in the case of larger paintings, you can unstretch it, roll it, and ship it. So, James is doing his painting there on canvas because he intends to ship it back to China, and it's a lot cheaper to ship it in a tube than it is to ship it in a giant crate. There's that advantage to canvas. Also, It's easy to select a size the day you need it and just make one. Lots of advantages that way. You can cut it down more easily and mount it if you need to change the size. As far as cotton versus linen, cotton is less springier. The fibers are not as long as linen. And it doesn't hold up as well under atmospheric changes. So there comes some issues with cotton canvas, especially over larger sizes. If you start to stretch really large canvases, they're not going to hold up as well as linen, and they can start to sag down the road. So you have to be kind of careful with cotton. I think conservators will tell you don't even use cotton at all. Use linen if you want to use something. If you really want to use canvas, you should mount it to a board. But mounting even cotton to a board will certainly eliminate a lot of the flaws with it as far as its weakness and tendency to sag. So ultimately, cotton canvas will be cheaper than linen. So if you're going to go off of just economy and you want the tooth of the canvas, then you might as well just buy cotton canvas, mount it to a board, and then prepare that.
Yeah, I have a lot of the old cotton canvases, like Fredericks. So I can do 2 or 3 layers of, is it gesso?
Usually we don't use gesso on fabric supports because gesso is so brittle.
Well,
but you could use a primer on it.
I guess I mean a primer.
Okay.
They're acrylic primed, but I want to oil prime them. So I put 2 or 3 layers on that and use it. Because I mean, let's face it, I'm not going to be producing anything that wants to be around in 400 years.
Not like that attitude.
But with the rare exception that I might, can that then be mounted to a harder surface like a hardboard or plywood or something?
You just cut it off and glue it down, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, without damaging the painting.
Yeah, you'll want to allow sufficient time to dry. So
Right.
6 months to a year if you're going to mount it. If you end up wanting to re-stretch a painting, however, you need to do it 1 to 2 weeks after the painting is completed, because you actually want to re-stretch it before it's completely dry.
Okay.
Otherwise, don't.
Otherwise, mount it. Yeah.
But then wait a year and it won't damage the painting when you're braying it.
Well, it depends on how vigorously you're braying it, but yeah.
Vigorously.
How big the layers are.
And yeah, and if you're doing like Van Gogh and Pasto, then
Yeah.
you're probably going to have some issues.
Okay.
But yeah, you can go ahead and mount that. It's, canvas is only rated to last 1 to 200 years. And it is more susceptible to yellowing and falling apart with the atmosphere. So you have to kind of keep that in mind if you're using cotton canvas. Linen is rated to generally last 300 to 400 years, more resistant to moisture. So that's why it's a little nicer to paint on usually, because it doesn't suck it up like a sponge. But certainly mount it if you can. The highest grade linens that are strongest and most resilient and last longest come from Europe, and lesser grades come from Asia. But again, if you mount it, you bypass a lot of issues.
And on the linen, you would gesso it or with oil?
No, gesso is not a suitable primer for flexible cotton substrates. You can gesso linen and cotton if you mounted it, but don't use gesso on a stretched substrate.
Really?
Too late.
Too late. I would be willing to bet money that
Doesn't it
none of you
matter?
except Mike have even touched gesso,
Yeah.
or even know what gesso is.
Oh, wait, gesso, there's different kinds of
Yeah, like
gesso.
acrylic
Tons,
gesso.
all the
Those
time.
aren't gessos.
They call
Those
it
are
that,
like
though.
dispersion
Like
crowns.
Liquitex
Yeah.
isn't really gesso, even though they call it
That's what I
gesso.
have.
Yeah, gesso is a mixture of rabbit skin glue, gypsum chalk that you spread onto a firm substrate
It's
that
really
produces a
only
very
suitable for
absorbent ground that is originally intended for egg tempera
So you're talking about the real gesso versus the gesso that's labeled
sold
gesso?
versus primer.
If you buy gesso in Blick, it's gonna be
Gesso,
Liquitex,
then
and
it's
it's
primer.
just gonna be
then it's primer.
Then
yeah.
you would put that on cotton.
So what happened is a couple decades ago, they wanted to put acrylic rounds on the market, but people didn't want to buy them because they didn't know what they were, so they started using the word gesso because people knew that gesso was something historically sound. So some of the cheaper companies will put the word gesso on there to trick you into thinking that it's a traditional historical ground. But you'll notice like Winsor Newton and Gamblin for their oil grounds, they don't say oil gesso on them, they say oil ground or oil painting ground on them because they're not gessos and they're not trying to hide the fact that they're not gessos.
He wants
You
us
can
to-
put gesso on anything that's hard like this. You can put the acrylic and oil primer on anything,
Okay,
hard or flexible.
just a little more with it, foil, double layer.
Yes, and you will probably not like painting on actual gesso. It's so absorbent, it sucks it all up.
Or you could just use neutral.
It's like, it would be like painting on drywall that hasn't been prepped. If you've ever painted walls in a house and you put up drywall, so you're supposed to prime it first so you can paint it. If you don't prime it, you go to paint it, it just, yeah, that's gesso.
That's what you use.
Okay, good. Yeah, Eddie's bringing up some of the other fabrics because some artists for economy try to do fabric blends or silk or other stuff like that. Those are not rated for any sort of stretch thing. They're not firm enough to hold a paint film. But again, it's one of those things where if you like the texture, you could mount it and be okay with it. But you wouldn't want to stretch it.
You know my velvet?
Yes, and mixed fibers, you'll see that pop up in some canvases now. Mixed fibers are only good if they've actually blended the fibers in the individual strands. So if they've mixed it and say have, one fiber going this way and one fiber going this way, that's not good because they have unequal tensions and strengths. So it'll start to sag in one direction and not the other. So you have to trust the company that they've intertwined the various fibers into each strand before creating the canvas. And if they've done that, then they can produce a reasonable substrate to paint on.
And would that be like with a polyester or some
Yeah, like
artificial type
polyester, acrylic,
Yeah.
yeah, there's lots of synthetic and even...
So basically, the threads have to be mixed versus the warp different than the woof.
Yes.
They have to be spun together.
Wool.
Wool, same, well, wool is,
Why would you want to paint on wool? That's
Yeah.
kind of
We
creepy.
get a lot of sheets.
That's artsy crafty.
I don't know.
yeah,
You're edging
it's
it.
not something you're gonna see in an art supply store.
Huh?
It's not something you're gonna see in an art supply store.
Yeah.
And I would just say don't go to a fabric store to pick out your stuff to paint on. No, I mean, it's a legitimate thing because I know some people who are like, oh, I went down to Joann's and just got a bolt of this cheap cotton to paint on, and it's not good. Like, if you are dealing with raw canvas or fabric to paint on, if you hold it up and you can see holes through or light coming through it, then it's not something good to paint on. So you need something that's got a really tight, close
You
weave.
gotta get those sequins off.
But you want the texture.
The other, you'll hear people say hemp and jute and some of those stuff. Burlap, yeah, all of those not good. Stay away from those. Gossingen says
It's a little
steer
bit,
clear.
yeah, could-